Nobody cares what you did 30 years ago, Dad, my son texted me. It was funny because the moment I walked into the VIP reception for the Scioto River Memorial Bridge project, the entire room went cold. The billionaire developer funding the $50 million contract stopped mid-speech, stared at my worn carpenter's jacket, and dropped his gold scissors onto the marble floor. He didn't greet the politicians. He didn't shake hands with the executives. He walked past my son, stopped 3 feet in front of me, and bowed his head. I've spent 30 years searching for the combat engineer who held that concrete span together. My son Ethan went pale, his voice trembling as he whispered, "Dad, what is he talking about?" Before I tell you my story, please leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from today. And if you're new here, welcome to Father's Raw Justice. 3 weeks before that rain-slick Tuesday in Columbus, Ohio, my life moved at the quiet pace I had chosen. I am Frank Donovan, 67 years old, a retired Army Corps of Engineers major, and for the last 15 years, a simple wood restorer working out of a dusty garage on the edge of town. Most people in Franklin County knew me as the old guy who fixed antique rocking chairs, repaired broken church pews, and sharpened circular saw blades for young contractors who didn't know how to keep an edge. I charged modest prices, often trading my labor for a sack of fresh corn, a crate of motor oil, or simply a good conversation over lukewarm coffee. That peaceful existence was precisely what my late wife Mary had wanted for us before she passed away 4 years ago. Losing Mary had carved an empty space in my chest that no project could ever fill, but my workshop kept my hands busy and my mind steady. Every morning began identically. I brewed dark roast coffee, sat on my back porch watching the fog lift off the Scioto River, and ran my fingers over an old, brass-trimmed spirit level resting on my workbench, a gift from my former platoon members in 1994. While some retired officers enjoyed wearing their medals to parade grounds or boasting about their tactical victories at local diners, I kept my military service locked away. My 30 years in the Army, including 3 combat deployments and dozens of critical bridge-building operations, were represented inside a battered steel footlocker in my basement. Folded dress uniforms, silver oak leaf insignias, commendations, blueprints, and yellowed casualty reports sat in the dark. I believed that true service was something you carried in your character, not something you wore on your lapel to demand applause. Unfortunately, my 38-year-old son, Ethan, viewed value through a completely different lens. Ethan was the chief executive officer of Donovan Dynamics, a commercial development firm based in downtown Columbus. He drove a pristine European luxury SUV, wore $3,000 tailored suits, and measured human worth strictly by net worth, corporate titles, and high society connections. While I was proud that he had built a stable business, his growing arrogance and deep-seated shame regarding his working-class roots made my heart ache. On a chilly Thursday afternoon, while I was wiping walnut stain off my hands with a shop rag, my cell phone buzzed on the workbench. It was a brief text from Ethan. "Dinner at the downtown club this Saturday at 6. Wear a suit that doesn't smell like sawdust." There was no greeting, no politely phrased invitation, and no inquiry about my health. I simply typed back, "I'll be there, son." Seconds later, another message buzzed on the screen. "And please, don't talk about your old carpenter shop or your Army engineering stories. Mr. Harrison Vance will be at our table, and he only cares about high-yield infrastructure investments." I stood motionless in the cool draft of my workshop, staring down at the glowing screen. I remembered what Mary used to whisper whenever Ethan acted cold. "Frank, young men who chase status are usually terrified that people will see how small they feel inside. Be patient with them." Saturday evening arrived with a heavy downpour over downtown Columbus. The city lights reflected off wet asphalt as I parked my 12-year-old pickup truck between 2 pristine sports cars in the valet line of the Capitol Club. I smoothed down the lapels of my dark gray wool suit, the same suit I'd worn to Mary's funeral, and walked inside. My 9-year-old grandson Liam spotted me immediately near the coat rack. "Grandpa!" he shouted, throwing his arms around my waist in a tight hug. I smiled, placing a calloused hand on his shoulder. "How's that wooden birdhouse we started last week, pal?" Before Liam could answer, Ethan stepped into the foyer holding a glass of scotch. He offered a stiff, formal handshake that felt more like a corporate greeting than a father-son reunion. Glad you made it, Dad, Ethan said, his eyes scanning my tie with mild disapproval. We're at table 4. Try to keep the conversation focused on real estate. As we sat down, I found myself surrounded by Ethan's wealthy board members and corporate partners, all engaged in loud chatter about stock options, private jet leases, and offshore accounts. An associate turned politely to me, asking what line of work I had been in before retiring. I restore historic woodwork down in Franklin County, I replied quietly. And before that, I worked in heavy structural engineering for the Army. The associate gave a tight, polite smile, uttered a brief, tradesman work, and immediately turned his back to resume discussing venture capital with Ethan. That cold shoulder didn't bother me. I was well accustomed to being overlooked. But 20 minutes later, over dessert, Ethan crossed a line that cut deeper than I anticipated. One of the investors pointed toward an architectural rendering displayed on an easel near the head table, a $50 million project to demolish and rebuild the historic Scioto River Bridge. The investor casually asked Ethan if his father had ever worked on large public structures during his military days. Ethan let out a dismissive chuckle, interjecting loudly in front of the entire table. Oh, trust me. My dad makes it sound like he was an engineer, but he was basically a glorified carpenter. He spent most of his military career filing maintenance reports, repairing wooden barracks, and sharpening tools in supply sheds while real officers made the decisions. Light laughter rippled across the table. Ethan raised his glass with a smug grin, completely failing to notice young Liam, looking back and forth between his father and grandfather with a deeply confused expression. I maintained a calm, steady posture, looking directly into my son's eyes. I just built what was needed to keep young men safe, Ethan. Nothing more. Ethan smirked. See? Nothing grand ever happened. At the end of the night, as guests filtered out toward the valet, Ethan's sister, my daughter Grace, a soft-spoken elementary school teacher, walked with me to my truck. She squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with quiet anger. Dad, I'm so sorry about how Ethan talked tonight. He's so obsessed with impressing Harrison Vance that he's losing his mind. Don't worry about it, Grace, I said softly, opening my truck door. People who shout about their importance are usually trying to convince themselves. 3 days later, a thick cream-colored envelope bearing the crest of the Ohio Department of Transportation and the Vance Development Group arrived in my mailbox. Inside was an official invitation to the groundbreaking ceremony for the new bridge, but glued to the back was a handwritten post-it note from Ethan. Dad, I saw your name on the general public mailing list for the ceremony. Please do not show up. Harrison Vance is cutting the ribbon, and I can't have you wandering around in work boots embarrassing our firm in front of the press. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, watching the rain strike the window pane. I looked at the spirit level on my counter, then down at the text message that arrived seconds later on my phone. Nobody cares what you did 30 years ago, Dad. I didn't get angry. I simply folded the paper, set it beside Mary's picture, and whispered into the quiet room. It's time he learns who held that ground. The rain over Columbus had stopped by mid-afternoon on Tuesday, leaving behind a heavy gray fog that hung over the Scioto River like a wet blanket. Across the water, the 50-year-old steel and concrete bridge stood quiet, its rusted iron girders and cracked support pillars scarred by decades of floods, heavy truck traffic, and brutal Ohio winters. For 3 weeks, Ethan had worked 16-hour days to ensure the groundbreaking ceremony for the new $50 million replacement bridge was a triumph for his firm, Donovan Dynamics. He had leased high-end marquees, hired a classical string quartet, invited local television news stations, and arranged for a fleet of black luxury sedans to transport the executive board of Vance Development Group. By 2 o'clock, the Riverside Park near the bridgehead was bustling with tailored suits, silk ties, expensive umbrellas, and local politicians holding polished brass shovels. In the center of the VIP pavilion stood Harrison Vance, 70 years old, silver-haired, erect as a flagpole, wearing an immaculate navy trench coat over an expensive suit. Harrison was a legend in Midwestern real estate, a billionaire developer who had transformed downtown Cleveland and Columbus, but he was also known as an intensely private man who rarely granted media interviews and demanded absolute integrity from every contractor he hired. Ethan stood 2 steps behind Harrison, adjusting his cufflinks every 30 seconds, his face flushed with nervous ambition. Everything is precisely on schedule, Mr. Vance. Ethan said, leaning in with a practiced, polished smile. The city council approved the final zoning variance at noon. Our demolition crews are staged on the north bank, and the press corps is locked in for the 3 o'clock broadcast. This project is going to anchor your company's legacy in central Ohio. Harrison Vance didn't look at the press stage or the gleaming corporate banners bearing Ethan's company logo. His piercing blue eyes were fixed entirely on the rusted base of the central concrete pillar rising from the muddy river current. "Legacy isn't built on press releases, Mr. Donovan," Harrison said softly, his voice gravelly and slow. "It's built on structural integrity. Tell me, did your historical assessment team find the original engineering logs from the flood of '94? Ethan hesitated for half a second, taken slightly off guard. He forced a light, dismissive laugh. "The '94 flood? Sir, those old municipal records were digitized terribly. Most of the original Army Corps files were written off as routine maintenance logs. Frankly, those '94 repairs were just quick patch jobs done by low-level military carpenters before the state took over the span." Harrison turned his head slowly, looking at Ethan for 3 long seconds. He didn't speak. He simply turned back toward the river, his mouth set in a thin, tight line. Ethan didn't notice the sudden coldness in Harrison's expression because his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his jaw tightened in immediate irritation. Walking slowly down the paved pedestrian path toward the VIP entrance was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a faded brown canvas jacket, dark denim trousers, and sturdy work boots. He carried an old leather blueprint tube slung over one shoulder and held a battered wooden box in his right hand. It was my father, Frank. Ethan turned to his security guard near the red velvet rope. "Excuse me for a moment, Mr. Vance," Ethan muttered, rushing toward the entrance before my father could reach the paved pavilion. Ethan intercepted my father 20 feet outside the tent, stepping directly into his path. "What are you doing here, Dad?" Ethan hissed in a low, furious whisper, grabbing my father's sleeve to pull him behind a catering van out of sight of the cameras. "I sent you a text. I explicitly told you not to come. Look at you. You're wearing work boots to a $50 million corporate event." My father stopped, looking down at Ethan's hand on his coat until Ethan reluctantly let go. Frank's face was completely calm, his gray eyes steady, unbothered by his son's panic. "I didn't come to ruin your party, Ethan," my father said quietly, his voice deep and grounded. "I came because 32 years ago, I swore an oath to inspect every load-bearing joint on this riverbank before anyone put a hydraulic drill into that stone." Ethan let out a bitter, exasperated laugh, rubbing his forehead with both hands. "An oath? Dad, stop with the dramatic theater. You were a carpenter. You fixed wooden benches and filled out supply forms. You have no standing here. This isn't a church picnic or a local hardware store. The man standing inside that tent is Harrison Vance. If he sees an uninvited old man in a canvas jacket wandering around my site, it makes Donovan Dynamics look unprofessional." My father looked at Ethan for a long moment, the quiet sadness in his eyes deepening, not because of the insult to his coat or his boots, but because he saw how completely his son had surrendered his dignity for a corporate contract. "Your mother always said that true pride is knowing who you are when the room is empty, Ethan," my father said softly. "You're so busy trying to look like you own this city that you've forgotten who laid the foundation." "I don't have time for your lectures, Dad," Ethan snapped, stepping back toward the tent. "Stay behind the security rope with the general public. Do not come inside the VIP enclosure. If you step onto that stage, I will have security escort you off the premises. I mean it." Ethan turned on his heel and strode back into the carpeted pavilion, smoothing his Italian tie and flashing a tight smile at a passing city councilwoman. My father stood alone behind the catering truck in the cold November drizzle. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply set his wooden box on the bumper of the truck, opened the latch, and reached inside. Nested in worn red velvet was the brass-trimmed spirit level his platoon had given him in 1994, along with a faded, oil-stained linen blueprint bearing the official crest of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, 103rd Engineer Battalion. Frank ran his thumb over the engraved brass plate on the side of the wooden level. "Presented to Major Frank Donovan for holding the span." My father closed the box, tucked it firmly under his arm, and walked toward the general spectator area near the microphone stand, stepping into the light just as the master of ceremonies took the stage. The rain had tapered off into a chilly mist, but inside the sprawling VIP pavilion, The air-conditioned atmosphere was warm and filled with the gentle clink of champagne flutes. Ethan stood near the edge of the elevated press platform, adjusting his tie and checking his reflection in the dark glass of a camera monitor. Everything was moving according to his meticulously planned script. The local news crews had positioned their heavy camera rigs along the perimeter. The mayor had arrived, surrounded by city council members, and the four-piece string quartet was playing a soft rendition of a patriotic hymn. Harrison Vance stood at the center of the stage, flanked by senior vice presidents from his development empire. He had not touched the glass of sparkling water offered to him, nor had he glanced at the glossy presentation folders Ethan's team had distributed. His eyes remained fixed on the crowd of nearly 200 local residents gathered behind the velvet security rope outside the tent. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced, his voice booming over the high-powered public address system, "we are about to begin the official groundbreaking ceremony for the Scioto River Memorial Bridge Project. Please welcome the Chief Executive Officer of Donovan Dynamics, Mr. Ethan Donovan." Ethan flashed his practiced 100-watt smile, smoothing his suit jacket as polite applause rippled through the front rows. He stepped up to the wooden podium, gripping its edges with absolute confidence. "Thank you," Ethan began, his tone projecting easy authority and polished warmth. "Today marks a historic turning point for Columbus. For decades, our city has depended on an aging, obsolete concrete structure, a bridge built by low-level military work crews back in the 90s that has long outlived its usefulness. Today, through the visionary leadership of Vance Development Group, we begin replacing the past with a $50 million symbol of modern progress." In the front row, Harrison Vance's eyebrows pulled together slightly. His hands, resting on the wooden railing, tightened until his knuckles turned pale. "We stand here today," Ethan continued, raising his voice for dramatic effect, "because modern engineering and corporate vision know how to build structures that last. We don't rely on patch jobs or old carpenter tactics. We build for the future." A wave of applause broke out among the corporate sponsors. Ethan grinned, feeling the intoxicating rush of total professional victory. He turned toward the billionaire developer. "And now, it is my distinct honor to introduce the man whose vision is making this $50 million miracle possible, Mr. Harrison Vance." Harrison did not smile. He walked slowly to the podium, his posture unyielding, his silver hair catching the sharp glare of the television spotlights. He adjusted the microphone, but instead of opening his leather binder, he looked out across the audience in complete silence. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The crowd grew quiet. Ethan took a subtle half-step forward, whispering urgently under his breath, "Page 2 of the talking points, Mr. Vance." Harrison ignored him completely. 32 years ago, Harrison spoke into the microphone, his voice gravelly, deep, and carrying an unexpected heavy weight that silenced every conversation in the pavilion. The spring flood of 1994 brought 6 inches of rain over this valley in less than 12 hours. The river rose 14 feet above flood stage. I was a 22-year-old second lieutenant in the Army National Guard, stationed right here on this bank with 40 young soldiers. Ethan's smile faltered. He blinked rapidly, glancing nervously toward the television cameras. "The old timber supports were buckling," Harrison continued, his gaze drifting over the heads of the executives directly toward the public spectator area. "The civil authorities had evacuated the town, but 40 of my men were trapped on the south embankment with rising waters behind them. The state engineers called the bridge unsafe and refused to send heavy equipment across it. They told us to abandon our vehicles and swim." The entire ballroom-style tent felt completely soundless. The soft hum of the central heating unit above the golden ceiling felt deafeningly loud. "One Army Corps engineer officer refused to abandon us," Harrison said, his voice trembling slightly with an emotion no one in the room had ever heard from the ruthless billionaire. "He didn't file paperwork. He didn't ask for a corporate permit. He walked out onto that creaking, flooded concrete span in the dark, with water rushing over his knees, carrying a brass spirit level and a manual winch. He spent 4 hours under that bridge in freezing water, hand-bracing the load-bearing joints while my 40 men crossed to safety." Harrison paused, leaning heavily against the podium. When the state inspection team arrived the next morning, that officer refused to take credit for saving 40 lives. He packed his wooden toolbox, signed the logbook as a routine maintenance shift, and walked away. Ethan felt a strange, icy coldness creep up his neck. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Harrison looked directly at Ethan. "You just called that man's work an obsolete patch job, Mr. Donovan." Ethan went completely pale. "Mr. Vance, I was just referring to the municipal records." Harrison held up one hand, cutting Ethan off with absolute terrifying finality. He turned back to the microphone. "Before I sign a $50 million contract with any firm," Harrison announced clearly, his words echoing through the press speakers, "I require absolute integrity. I spent 32 years trying to find the engineer who held that span together. And 3 days ago, the Department of Transportation finally confirmed the name on that 1994 emergency logbook." Harrison stepped away from the podium, unbuttoned his immaculate navy coat, and walked down the steps of the main stage. He didn't look at the mayor. He ignored the city council members. He walked past the row of corporate sponsors, straight toward the velvet security rope at the edge of the general spectator section. The security guards quickly unhooked the rope. My father, Frank Donovan, stood in the second row of the general public area, dressed in his faded brown canvas jacket and sturdy work boots, holding his old wooden toolbox calmly under his left arm. Harrison Vance stopped exactly 3 feet away from my father. The billionaire developer, adorned with every prestige business and civic leadership could confer, brought his feet together, straightened his posture like a young cadet, brought his right hand crisply to his eyebrow, and delivered a rigid, flawless military salute that hung frozen in the air. "Welcome home, Major Donovan," Harrison said softly, his eyes brimming with unashamed tears. "Thank you for keeping my men alive." In the VIP section, Ethan stood transfixed, his face completely drained of color. His hand trembled violently against the oak railing, dropping his glass onto the carpeted floor with a soft thud that nobody noticed. Ethan gasped for air as his throat seized up, staring at his father in utter paralyzed disbelief as he whispered to himself, "Dad, who on earth are you?" The rain outside the VIP marquee had completely ceased, but inside the carpeted structure, a suffocating, heavy silence hung in the air. Every news camera was locked onto Harrison Vance. The billionaire developer remained in his rigid military posture, his arm raised in a crisp, unwavering salute toward the man standing in the public section. Behind him, the mayor, the city council members, and the executive board of Donovan Dynamics stood completely frozen, their mouths slightly agape. Ethan felt the floor beneath his $3,000 leather shoes give way, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked from his father's calm, weathered face to the tear-filled eyes of Harrison Vance, unable to process the reality unfolding before him. "Mr. Vance?" Ethan choked out, stepping forward with a trembling hand. There must be a misunderstanding. This is my father, Frank Donovan. He's just a local furniture restorer, a former shop mechanic." Harrison Vance did not turn around immediately. He slowly lowered his salute, took a deep, steadying breath, and turned his head toward Ethan. The warmth that had filled his eyes when looking at Frank vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp disgust that cut deeper than any verbal reprimand. "A shop mechanic?" Harrison asked, his gravelly voice cutting through the silent room like a razor. "Is that what you told your board members, Mr. Donovan?" I meant 32 years ago," Harrison interrupted, stepping within 2 feet of Ethan. "When 40 National Guard soldiers were trapped on the south bank of the Scioto River with 5 feet of icy floodwater rising around their waists, the state civil engineers ran away. They declared the bridge structural deadweight. Do you know who stayed?" Ethan swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. "No, sir." "Your father," Harrison said, pointing a finger toward Frank. "Major Frank Donovan took a manual winch, a pair of steel cables, and a single brass spirit level, and crawled beneath that groaning concrete span in pitch-black darkness. He spent 4 hours in chest-deep freezing water, hand-tightening tension rods so that my men could walk a coin. When the regional command tried to issue him a silver star, he refused to sign the paperwork. He told the general that saving young men was a duty, not a photo opportunity." A quiet gasp rippled through the gathered press corps. Microphones were thrust closer. Flashbulbs began flashing rhythmically, capturing the agonizing contrast between Ethan's pale, sweat-beaded face and his father's stoic dignity. Harrison turned toward his executive director, David Miller. "David?" "Yes, Mr. Vance?" Cancel the infrastructure agreement with Donovan Dynamics immediately. Ethan's eyes widened in sheer horror. The blood drained from his face until he looked like a ghost. Mr. Vance, please, you can't do this. We've invested 6 months of capital into this groundbreaking. Your shareholders should have evaluated your character before trusting you with $50 million of public infrastructure, Harrison said coldly. A man who erases his own father from an honor list to impress wealthy investors is a man who will cut corners on concrete and rebar the second no one is looking. I do not do business with men who lack foundational integrity. Ethan stumbled back a step, looking wildly around the room for support. His board members looked away, suddenly fascinated by the patterns on the carpet. The city council members quietly stepped back, distancing themselves from the disgraced CEO. Frank stepped forward past the velvet rope. He set his old wooden toolbox on the edge of the press table and looked at Harrison Vance. Harrison, Frank said quietly, using the billionaire's first name without hesitation. The bridge still needs to be built. Central Ohio needs that river crossing. Don't let personal anger halt a public necessity. The room gasped again. Here was a retired carpenter in a canvas jacket, addressing the most powerful developer in the Midwest as an equal, advising him on a multi-million-dollar decision. Harrison looked at Frank, his harsh expression softening slightly. Major, I won't let a man who disrespected your sacrifice profit off the span you saved. The firm has good engineers, Harrison, Frank replied steadily, glancing briefly at Ethan, whose head was now hanging in absolute shame. My son made terrible choices because he chased status instead of truth, but the workers who poured the concrete samples didn't do anything wrong. Transfer the supervision to an independent oversight board. Let the project move forward under proper ethics. Harrison stared at Frank for a long moment, then let out a slow, respectful sigh. You're still the same man who stood in the freezing river, aren't you, Frank? Always thinking about the load the bridge has to carry, not who gets the credit. I just know how to measure what's level, Frank said softly, gesturing toward the wooden toolbox under his arm. Harrison turned to his attorney. Restructure the contract. Donovan Dynamics is removed as lead developer, but the subcontractors remain. Ethan Donovan will have no voting authority, no public role, and no financial bonuses from this project. The engineering oversight will report directly to Major Frank Donovan. Ethan stood frozen as the reality of his downfall settled over him. In less than 10 minutes, he had lost his prestige, his corporate standing, his $50 million triumph, and the respect of every influential person in Central Ohio. But worse than the financial collapse was the suffocating weight of his own moral nakedness. As the press corps rushed forward to ask Frank questions, Frank simply shook Harrison's hand, picked up his wooden box, and walked past the flashing cameras toward the exit. Ethan ran out of the marquee into the cold afternoon drizzle, catching up to his father near the parking lot. "Dad!" Ethan cried out, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his face, washing away his polished corporate persona. "Dad, please, stop!" Frank stopped near the door of his 12-year-old pickup truck and turned around slowly. Ethan fell to his knees on the damp gravel, his expensive Italian suit soaking in the muddy water. He looked up at his father, his hands trembling uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," Ethan sobbed, his chest heaving. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I thought success meant driving the right car, wearing the right suit, standing with rich men. I was ashamed of your workshop. I was ashamed of your boots. God forgive me, I erased you." Frank stood in the rain, looking down at his weeping son. He didn't yell, he didn't kick Ethan while he was down. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the crumpled Post-it note Ethan had sent him 3 weeks ago, and let it fall onto the wet ground beside Ethan's knee. Ethan looked down at his own handwriting through his tears. "Nobody cares what you did 30 years ago, Dad." "I forgive you for the text, Ethan," Frank said, his voice quiet, calm, and filled with a profound, unshakable sorrow. "Because a father always forgives his child. But forgiveness doesn't mean I will let you treat my dignity as disposable. You built your whole life on a foundation of sand, son. Now it's time you learn how to build something real." Frank climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove slowly down the river road, leaving Ethan kneeling alone in the mud as the rain began to fall again over the Scioto River. The sound of rain tapping against the tin roof of my workshop had always brought me a sense of peace that no bustling city or high-stakes corporate environment could ever provide. By 8 o'clock that evening, the rain had settled into a steady, quiet rhythm over the outskirts of Columbus. Inside the garage, the air smelled rich with walnut stain, damp cedar, and warm black coffee. The single fluorescent light above my workbench cast a soft golden glow across the antique tools I had used for nearly 3 decades. Tools that had restored broken heritage, built homes for neighbors, and held together a collapsing river span when 40 young soldiers had nowhere else to turn. I was sitting on my wooden stool, running a fine grit sandpaper over the edge of an old white oak picture frame, when the small bell above the side entry door chimed softly. I didn't turn around immediately. I knew the sound of those heavy, hesitant steps. Ethan stepped into the workshop alone. Gone was the immaculate $3,000 suit, the gold watch, and the polished leather shoes that had crossed the marble foyer of the VIP pavilion earlier that afternoon. He wore a simple, wet canvas jacket, dark denim trousers that were mud-stained at the cuffs, and a pair of old work boots he hadn't worn since his college years. His hair was damp from the rain, and his face looked hollow, stripped entirely of the aggressive, status-driven ambition that had defined him for a decade. He stopped 10 feet away from my workbench, holding a brown paper bag in his trembling hands. He stood there in complete silence, listening to the rain on the roof, looking at the sawdust on the concrete floor, looking at the brass-trimmed spirit level resting beside my coffee mug. "Mind if I sit down, Dad?" Ethan asked. His voice was no longer sharp, loud, or condescending. It was quiet, raspy, and stripped of all armor. I set my sandpaper down on the workbench, wiped my hands with a red shop rag, and gestured toward the wooden rocking chair in the corner, the chair his mother, Mary, used to sit in while watching me work. "I'd be glad if you did, son," I answered softly. Ethan walked over, pulled the chair forward, and sat down. He placed the brown paper bag on the small side table between us. Inside were 2 warm, foil-wrapped sandwiches and 2 paper cups of dark roast coffee from the small, family-owned diner 3 blocks down the street, the same diner I had taken him to every Saturday morning when he was 9 years old. "I remembered you liked the dark roast with no sugar," Ethan murmured, his eyes fixed on the concrete floor. "I still do," I said, reaching over to take one of the coffee cups. For nearly 5 minutes, neither of us spoke. We just sat together in the quiet workshop, drinking warm coffee while the rain washed against the glass window panes. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the heavy, necessary quiet that settles over 2 men when the noise of the world has finally been turned off and only the raw truth remains. "I lost the lead contract today," Ethan said quietly, staring into his black coffee. "Harrison Vance removed me from the development board. He transferred executive oversight of the Scioto River project to an independent engineering council, reporting directly to you." "I know," I replied calmly. "Harrison called me 20 minutes ago." Ethan swallowed hard, a fresh tear welling up in his eyes and slipping down his cheek. "I thought my life was over when he said that in front of the press, Dad. I thought everything I had built, my title, my company, my reputation, had vanished in 10 seconds. He paused, his hands shaking slightly against the paper cup. But as I was driving through the rain back to my empty office, I realized something much worse. He looked up at me, his eyes red and filled with an agonizing, profound regret. "My life wasn't destroyed because I lost a $50 million contract, Dad," Ethan choked out, his voice cracking. "My life was destroyed because I spent 10 years pretending that a piece of paper, a luxury car, and the applause of rich strangers made me a man, while I treated the man who gave me everything like a ghost." I leaned back against my workbench, looking at my son with a deep, quiet warmth. I didn't interrupt him. I let him speak. "I was ashamed of you," Ethan whispered, the words tearing out of his chest like a confession he had been running from for years. "I was terrified that if my wealthy investors saw your work boots, your pickup truck, or your dusty workshop, they would think I came from nothing. I erased your name from the guest list because I was afraid of who I was." He covered his face with both calloused hands, his shoulders shaking as he wept silently in his mother's rocking chair. I stood up from my stool, walked over, and placed a large, steady hand on his trembling shoulder, a firm, grounding hold that erased years of distance in a single second. "You didn't come from nothing, Ethan," I said, my voice steady and clear above the sound of the rain. You came from a home built on honest work, loyalty, and quiet sacrifice. Your mother and I didn't give you expensive European cars or private school legacies, but we gave you an example of how to stand straight when the wind blows. Ethan took a shaky breath, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. Is it too late for me to learn, Dad? I smiled, a soft, gentle expression that reached my eyes. It's never too late to learn how to measure what's level, son. But respect isn't something you can buy with a contract, and forgiveness isn't something that erases consequences. You have a long road ahead to rebuild your company, your integrity, and your character. Ethan looked at the old brass spirit level resting on my workbench, then back up at me. Where do I start? You start right here, I answered, handing him a sanding block from my tool rack. You start by putting your hands to honest work, by apologizing to your sister Grace, by showing young Liam what real strength looks like, and by remembering that a man's worth is measured by the people he protects, not the titles he displays. Ethan took the sanding block, his fingers gripping the worn wood tightly. He looked at the white oak picture frame on my workbench, the frame meant to hold a photograph of our family, and nodded with absolute, unshakable resolve. I'll be here every Saturday morning, Dad, Ethan whispered. Not for a photo, not for a contract, just to learn. By the time summer arrived in Columbus, the heavy rains had given way to bright golden afternoons. The Scioto River flowed peacefully beneath the old bridge, where construction crews were hard at work under the strict ethical oversight of an independent board. Every Saturday morning, without fail, Ethan's luxury SUV no longer pulled into the workshop driveway. Instead, he drove an old, practical utility truck. He spent his mornings beside me in the garage, learning how to join timber, how to restore antique wood, and how to listen to people without checking his phone. Sitting on my back porch as the evening sun dipped below the Ohio horizon, watching young Liam run across the grass while Ethan helped Grace repair a wooden garden bench under the shade of the oak tree, I knew my mission was finally complete. True honor was never found in a $50 million ceremony or the applause of 300 strangers. It was found right here, in the quiet, enduring love of a family that had finally learned to see with open hearts. The long journey was over, the foundation was secure, and the old engineer had lastly, truly come home.